maybe we'll be surprised in heaven.
I'd love to be surprised.
Had amazing influence. And, well, you know, I'm just going to encourage you that, how far does it go here, part one? There are a lot of interesting people and events. It's a page turner. But we need to get to part two, because this clearly wasn't filling that abyss that your dad dealt with all his life until a crusade.
Yes. Well, my father did have that continuing emptiness, like you said, that being around the stars and all the money and all of that didn't fill. He saw people killed right in front of him. He began to question where his life was going. He was invited by his own preacher father to attend this Billy Graham crusade, 1949, tent meeting, Washington and Hill, downtown Los Angeles. He said, "No, Dad, it's not for me." One Sunday afternoon, he and my mom were driving around, didn't have anything better to do. They passed by the tent, and my father just on the spur of the moment said, "Why don't we go in and see what this is about?" They went in, his jaw dropped. 6,000 people filling this huge tent. He tried to find everything wrong that he could with the whole meeting, but when Mr. Graham got up to speak, he couldn't find anything wrong with what he had to say.
Good thing your mom was 9 months pregnant.
Oh my goodness.
Every seat was filled.
Yes.
And people got up to give her a seat.
Oh, thankfully,
so they couldn't
yes.
leave.
They sat at the back, but they were there. And Mr. Graham that night preached on the passage where Jesus says, "What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world but lose his own soul?" And my dad knew that God was speaking to him. And then Mr. Graham did something very uncharacteristic. During the invitation, he said, "There's a man in this audience tonight who's heard this message many times before, but he's never given his life to Christ, and this may be his last opportunity." And that's what turned the corner for my father.
God was speaking to him.
Oh, to him individually. He turned to my mother and said, "I'll go." And he got up and he walked that sawdust trail and knelt and in the prayer tent and said, "God, if you'll mean business with me, I'll mean business with you."
The most impressive thing in this whole saga is the energy and the effort that this creative entrepreneur who was on the wrong side of the law put now into a needy world on so many levels, Will.
Oh, yes, yes. Of course, he had many things to make right first. He wanted not only to have his life right with God, but right with other people. He set about repaying everybody he'd ever cheated or stolen from until he had nothing left and was totally dependent on God to provide. But the Lord began to give him opportunities to share the story of how Jesus had changed his life, and he traveled around the United States and around the world and used his electronics to demonstrate the power of God.
Well, the Youth Hotline, that was kind of a new concept. I'm not sure what year that was.
Oh, yes, many years later. He always had a deep heart for youth because he had been so troubled and searching as a young man.
And this was really for runaways, wasn't it?
Yes, yes. That started in the late 70s, early 80s.
All part of Youth Development, Inc., which ran a camp as well. Let's take a look at a couple of pictures.
Okay.
I think we're going to see Billy Graham actually visiting one of your dad's.
Yes.
I won't say operations. That's
well,
the wrong word.
That's a good word for it. That's in New York City in 1960. My father started there in *58 trying to reach teenage gangs with the gospel.
Billy Graham with a gun?
Yes, that's a handmade gun, handmade by one of the gang members.
Now this again wasn't a crusade. That was just Dr. Graham.
Yes, my dad and Mr. Graham were good friends, and my dad invited him to come and see what he was doing with his boys' club there in the city, and Graham came and spoke to the kids. And it was the first time some of these kids had heard my father's story, because my dad really didn't force religion on any of them. He tried to win their friendship first and win the right to share with them about Jesus.
That picture we just got a glimpse of, we'll go back to it. I think this is right in the ghetto, isn't it, with these kids?
Yes, in Spanish Harlem, and there's some of the kids themselves at Camp Champion, which my father started in upstate New York. It's still going today. It's a Young Life camp now.
Now, there's so many chapters in the decades that followed, and his incredible work helping young people especially, but Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the famed Death and Dying author, donated her land, needed to give it to a nonprofit group, and your dad was on the receiving end of that?
Yes, there was a couple who were on her board at that time, and they knew of my father's ministry, and so out of all the nonprofits she considered all over the United States, she chose to give it to youth development. And my brother went there with my parents and started a youth camp that continues to reach hundreds of kids up and down the East Coast.
I think the enemy had this man targeted from the beginning. He was terribly scalded as a baby with boiling water.
Yes,
Not expected
and yet
to
made
live.
it through.
So many things. Polio, diabetes, Parkinson's at the end.
Yes.
Finally a broken hip. But he asked the Lord to take him home. He was ready.
Yes, he was very much ready. I don't know that we were quite ready to let him go, but he had had a long life of physical battles and struggles. So it was a good time for him to go home to be with the Lord.
How old was he, Will?
He was 78, almost 79.
We have a precious picture here of the dedication of one of your three sons. The first one?
Yes, that's the oldest. He's the namesake, James.
James. With Jim Vaus. Boy, a transformed life.
Yes, it's wonderful to see the power that God has to work on us from the inside out when we really surrender to Him.
Leighton Ford, Canadian,
Yes.
formerly with the Billy Graham team, talks so affectionately about your dad and about the letter of his life, a letter of Christ to a needy
Yes, we're
world.
each a letter from Christ as Christ begins to write on our lives. It's so wonderful when we let Him write the story, isn't it?
Nothing's impossible. I just think of heartbroken parents of children who maybe had a great start
Oh, yes.
and they've wandered into places that might seem unimaginable. Addiction, the wrong friends, far from the Lord. Your dad's a wonderful encouragement.
Yes, parents seeing their children go through that need to hang in there and keep praying. My grandmother prayed for 30 years, really, for my father before seeing him really come to personal faith in Christ and see his life changed.
Will Vaus, thank you for all that you write. I expect we're going to see this in a movie.
I hope so.
It needs
It's such
to
a
be.
wonderful story, not just the story of his conversion, but how God used him from that point on to touch the lives of hundreds of thousands of young people.
Yeah, we've just really done a little scraping off the top.
Absolutely.
There's chapters and chapters. And this book is available everywhere.
You can go to my website, willvaus.com, or to the publisher, believebooks.com, or Amazon, or your favorite bookstore.
Thank you so much. My father was a gangster, and what happened after that really deserves the read. Thank you so much, Will.
Thank you for having me.